to introduce our first speaker.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. I am really excited to be able to introduce our first speaker. This is our first time hosting a joint academia and industry event. It will be recorded, so if at any point you do need to hop off, we will be sending up the recordings, but we would love to have you stay so we could engage in some meaningful conversation. I'm really honored to have Catherine Meese joining us today. Catherine serves as the assistant professor in the Department of Health Services Administration at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. She also serves as the director of wellness research in the UAB Medicine Office of Wellness. Catherine earned her PhD in health sciences or services administration with a specialization in healthcare strategic management from the University of Alabama at Birmingham in 2019. And Dr. Meese has several years of industry experience, which encompass work in 10 countries on 4 continents, including management for a large academic medical center. She is also, as we are very lucky to have her, the chair of our well-being committee in the Leadership Excellence Networks. So I am just thrilled to have the opportunity to learn from and interact with Catherine regularly. Catherine is truly a leader and a force in the well-being space in healthcare and the leadership development space in healthcare, and is passionate about her quest to support what she refers to as the human margin. And so, Catherine, thank you for being here. I can't wait to hear your presentation, and I appreciate you.
It's a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. So if you could give me a thumbs up if everybody sees the full screen version of the slides and you can hear me. Okay, good. Well, welcome. It's a pleasure to see you today. I know so many of you. I see some very friendly faces here, and so it's always good to be among friends and colleagues. If we have not met, I'm very pleased to have you joining us. If you will, just for the sake of getting to know each other, maybe put your name, organization, and role in the chat so we can all get a little bit more acquainted. And you're more than welcome to be, active in the chat as we go along. I'll try to keep up with that and answer any questions as they pop up. Or because we have a smaller group, feel free to also unmute yourself and just ask a question or say, wait a minute, can you go back to that? My goal is not to talk at you, even though that's just what I did for the last 2 minutes. So today we're going to talk about a topic that I'm very passionate about and excited about, and it's this idea of the human margin. And so I'll dive a little bit more into what that means and how we can define that. But we have undergone a fundamental shift, a tremendous shift in our industry. And so today we're going to explore that a little bit and go into some of the research that we've been finding that relates to our humans in healthcare. All right. So 2020 was a disaster. We all know this, and we all lived through it, right? So everybody had some experience in 2020 with their world being turned upside down. And that's no more true than those of us who worked in or adjacent to the healthcare industry. This is true for our clinicians, for our administrative leaders, and even for our students. What 2020 did for us as a whole is to essentially elevate this concept of mortality salience, right? Mortality salience actually comes from the terrorism literature, which is kind of weird, I know, but it's this idea that death is near and it's going to happen to me. And so when I think about that, and when that feels close to me, then I rethink how I'm doing life, right? So it's the idea that Aunt Judy dies and I'm thinking, wow, life is short. How am I going to change the way that I'm living? And so because we saw so many people get sicker than they should have, who were otherwise young and healthy, who died. We had in healthcare colleagues that became sick and died from COVID. We saw patients who nobody thought their lives would be taken so soon. This really caused us in aggregate to have an elevated sense of mortality salience. And when that happens, people decide they're not going to put up with stupid stuff anymore, right? So if you're thinking about my life is short, what am I going to spend it doing? You're not going to do stupid stuff. You're not going to spend your time on meaningless work and non-value added tasks. And so this was a major force that led us to the Great Resignation. Unfortunately, in healthcare, it's pretty bad right now. I had a different title on the slide. It was not appropriate. And so I changed it to be a little more professional, but we are in a bad place. Let's look at the numbers. In 2021, 117,000 physicians left the healthcare workforce and only 40,000 entered it. Let's let that sink in. 334,000 clinicians left all types of the workforce. These are not just bodies leaving, these are years of experience, decades of training. More than 32% of nurses plan to leave the field altogether or retired. That number is as high as 66% for our critical care nurses. It's probably no surprise then that workforce shortages have topped the list of concerns, ACHE's list of concerns for healthcare CEOs. For every 6 people looking for a job, there are 10 open positions. So I'm seeing job descriptions literally go from master's required and 10 years of experience to has pulse, right? For those of us in academia, this means that, maybe some people who felt like they needed to get our degrees in the past are now saying, oh my gosh, I can roll out of bed and get the job I want. And so this is going to cause a major shock, both to the academic space, but also in healthcare organizations where people have their pick of where to go, and it may not be healthcare at all. In fact, in 2020 and between 2020 and 2022, of people who changed jobs in the healthcare industry, 54% did not return to the same industry. Meaning it's not just that people are leaving your organization or my organization, they're leaving healthcare altogether. And so that's really quite alarming. And given the nature of how we have to train, how long it takes to produce a baby nurse, 4 years, a baby physician, 12 years, when these people leave, it's a big problem. So if somebody leaves my organization because I don't treat them well, that's my issue. If somebody leaves the workforce altogether, that's our collective problem. And so we've got some strong headwinds here. So I want to kick off our conversation about the human margin by sort of honing in on this phrase that I know that all of my academic colleagues here have heard this and maybe said it ad nauseum. But if you've been in healthcare for long, you've probably heard this phrase, no margin, no mission. It was actually a term coined by a nun who was wanting to take more of a business approach to making sure that her organization had resources to be able to care for the poor and the needy in the community and to provide good services. What it has since become in some ways is really an emphasis on financial performance of healthcare organizations. And so this has become a little bit of a battle cry for having to make unpopular decisions in the name of financial performance, right? Oh, we have to let people go, no margin, no mission. But we really need to rethink how we are conceptualizing this idea of margin. So typically when we say no margin, no mission, from the manager level to the board level, the types of things that we are held accountable for around margin tend to be the financial margin and the operational margin. So financial margin, do we have more money coming in than we have going out? Can we grow and invest in the future and meet our mission? The operational margin, do we have enough beds, space, capacity, speed, quality, supplies? The human margin is not always on the list of things that the board is asking us about and holding us accountable for. Typically, when we talk about whether we have enough humans to meet our mission, it's in terms of really sort of dehumanizing terms. Do we have enough FTEs? What's our turnover rate? As if these are cookie cutter widgets that you can just remove one FTE and replace with another. We know that's not true. Looking at nurse vacancy rates, you've probably heard people talk about nurse vacancies. Losing one nurse who has 20 years of experience is not the same as getting one new bachelor's prepared nurse. And so rather than just asking, do we have enough people, right, to do this thing, we need to be asking, what is the capacity of our humans? Do they have enough emotional reserve to absorb the inherent difficulties of the work? Do we have enough people so that our team members can pee, right? So there's more, it's more than just having enough warm bodies, it's making sure that we're leaving space and capacity to absorb the inherent difficulties in this work. So I would like for us to reconceptualize this phrase of no margin, no mission by prioritizing the order, right? The order of operations matters. If we don't have humans, we have no margin and we have no mission. We're seeing this time and time again. With COVID, we had to cancel elective surgeries because it was mandated. That had a huge impact on financial and operational performance. But since, organizations have had to cancel elective surgeries because they don't have enough people. They have the beds, they have the surgeon, but they don't have enough support staff. And so without our humans, the economic engine of healthcare grinds to a halt. And so we have to make some pretty serious changes to make sure that we keep our people, right? We can't just go get new ones. because it takes a long time to train. So how do we keep our people? First, we need to think about how we keep them in the organization. And next, we need to think about how we keep them well. So we'll go through those two things today. All right, this is an oil refinery. I had the privilege of auditing an oil refinery one summer in Pascagoula, Mississippi, in July, and I would recommend that to no one, by the way. So an oil refinery is a large complex system filled with combustible fluid, and if one of these pieces malfunctions, the entire thing explodes, and it catches on fire and people die, and it costs a lot of money, tens of millions of dollars. So, you know, oil and gas companies are very, very focused on making sure that this system is functioning optimally, right? So they do this through two mechanisms, primarily routine maintenance and scheduled downtime. So anytime there is a hint of malfunction, it is an all hands on deck effort to make sure that this gets fixed, right? Because they know the consequence. And it's not like they're wondering what happens if a refinery explodes. We have had refineries explode. So we know. In healthcare, we are also in a large complex system with thousands of moving parts, and the stakes are no less high for good performance. We know that in broken systems, patients are hurt and employees become burned out. They're not optimized for good decision making. And so this whole thing starts to fall apart. And if a patient is harmed, it costs tens of millions of dollars potentially, right? So it's a problem. But we approach it very differently, right? So in the refinery, if things explode, people die, it costs money. If the system's not functioning, this is how we handle it on the left. In healthcare, we let people leave and then we replace them with someone else. It's really amazing that all of the warning signs are here for us that the factory is about to explode, right, in terms of our workforce. And yet what we're not seeing uniformly across organizations is an all hands on deck effort to make sure that we're doing everything we can to reprioritize our people and the human margin. And some of this goes right back to mission, vision, and values. You know, that's where a lot of this starts. Interestingly, in oil and gas, that very company that I had the opportunity to audit the refinery for, their vision was to be most admired for its people. So its people are front and center. And let's be clear, these organizations are mostly not people centric, right? It's large, expensive equipment in the middle of the ocean or in the middle of, you know, a refinery area. And you know, there are people that have to make that work, but it's not the same as healthcare, where literally our core business is humans working with humans to heal humans. And yet when you look at the mission, vision, value statement of many healthcare organizations, you see some variation on a theme of, you know, to deliver the best care to X community, whether that's the city, the region, the state, or the world. And so, but very seldom do you see in those same mission and vision statements a prioritization of its own workforce. And what's interesting to me is that we have this conceptualization that there are employees and there are patients, right? If I'm an organization thinking about how to improve the health of the community, in many communities, the healthcare employer and the healthcare organization is the largest employer in that community. It takes a lot of hands to do this work. And so I cannot care for the health of my community without providing healthy work for my own employees, because they are my community, right? These are not two separate buckets. And I think we miss out on that sometimes. But despite our stated mission, vision, and value statement, this focus on the people is often not felt by the people who work within those organizations. Again, with sometimes an overly heavy emphasis on the financial margin out of balance with other margins that we need to be considering. All right, shoot. So how do we keep these people? I'm going to present now to you some findings, preliminary findings from our own research, looking at over 10,000 healthcare workers over the course of 3 years. And we looked at why they would recommend an organization, why they would choose to stay, what factors are predicting that. And so these are the levers that are most likely, if we push and pull, these are the things most likely to get our people to stay. Right at the top of the list, interestingly, in Net Promoter Score, you see perceived organizational support. Does the organization value me, care about my extra efforts and contributions, and care about my well-being? And then second in place, we see trust in senior leadership. Trust and you know, further down the list, we see trust in supervisors. So there's sort of this old adage that, you know, people don't leave their jobs, they leave bad managers. And what our data is very clearly showing is that yes, the manager is important, but senior leadership is also important, and the feelings that you have about the larger organization. there were a lot of things in healthcare that were very difficult for senior leaders, for any leaders over the last 2 years, decisions that had to be made with no good options. We have no PPE. Do I send my employees in to die, or do I let the patients die? And so I think some harm was caused by decisions that really didn't have any right answer, and where you're choosing between two bad options. In addition to some overall loss of trust relating to different things that we saw play out on the national stage. Administrators taking vaccines before their frontline workers, running a hospital from their lake house, et cetera. So we've got some repair to do. In terms of things that are causing people to stay, job satisfaction, that's super obvious, right? You're not going to stay in your job if you're not satisfied there. Burnout makes the top 5 list. Trust in senior leadership shows up again. And then some of these other elements that we would expect to see from decades of organizational research, psychological safety and moral distress. 2 things that are important to point out here is that inadequate pay is only 7th on the list and explains a very small portion of the variance. And so a lot of times employees will say, I need more money, I'm leaving for the money, but it's usually not the money, right? And we'll dive into that a little bit more later. I won't spend much time here, but the different things that are triggering intention, or that are maintaining intention to stay across employees do vary by different groups, which we would expect to see. But I want to point out a couple things here. PTSD shows up for our clinical support staff as a major correlate of retention. And you see that time off requests being denied and inability to take time off is also a major concern for our physicians and our APPs. And pay is lower on the list in most of these groups. So certainly we see some real challenges here. I'll point out that on the previous slide, this one and the next one, we'll see autonomy kind of come up again and again. And we know from many years of organizational behavior research that autonomy is important to people. We celebrate Christmas in my family, and my daughter, when she was old enough to write her first Christmas list, asked for 3 things: an art kit, a mommy that does whatever she says, and a Barbie dream house. And so thank goodness Santa did not bring a mommy that does whatever she says down the chimney, but that desire for autonomy is strong, and it's in all of us, typically from a very young age. In healthcare, we've got a lot of challenges to autonomy. We tell you when to show up, where to show up, how to wash your hands. You have to wear matching pajamas, and we picked the color, and here's how you wash your hands. Oh, and by the way, you can't wear a beard because your N95 won't seal. And so any opportunities that we have in our organizations to give autonomy wherever we're able, whether that's flexible scheduling, whether that's giving people some choice over when and how they work, we have to do it because we have some strong headwinds in that area as an industry. All right, so let's jump into a little bit about how we keep people well, which is what we'll focus on for the remainder of our time together. So it's not just enough to keep people from running out the door. We also want to keep them well when they're in our organization. And so you have probably heard people talk about burnout a million times, but we're going to talk about it again. This is the formal definition of burnout. And we use the jobs, demands, resources theory framework to organize our thinking around this. And basically the theory suggests that well-being occurs at the intersection of the demands of the job and having enough resources to offset those demands. So you can get to that state of well-being either by increasing resources or by reducing demands. Unfortunately, what a lot of organizations do is focus on the resource side, right? We have EAP, we've got free counseling, we have this yoga session, we will give you lavender oil to put on yourself. It's not that any of those things are bad. Those things need to be there. Those supports have to be in place. But what our research continues to show is that the factors that are driving overall distress tend to be more on the demand side. And so if we are only adding resources and we're not reducing demands, we're never going to get to that balance that we're looking for. These are things like inefficient, broken processes, non-value added tasks, and emotionally demanding work that maybe is unnecessary, right? So having to explain to a patient or a visitor that you can't provide them with the care that they deserve and need to get because you're understaffed or because you have a broken process where you don't have the supplies that you need. So yeah, it's really important, the order of operations here. If we tell people, hey, sorry we broke you, here are some resources to go fix yourself, without making a good faith effort on reducing the demands and the cause of the brokenness of the work, it has, the potential to backfire. People say, I don't want a pizza party. I want you to fix this, terrible EHR, right? So loving a physician and taking care of them looks like getting rid of stupid stuff and making processes more efficient. Like that's what they want, to feel supported. So how are we doing on this? We measured in 2020, 2021, and 2022 across the entire healthcare team. Unfortunately, we saw rates decline precipitously in that time period, but they're still concerningly high. This is a measure of distress that is like being stressed out on steroids. It's associated with almost threefold increased risk of burnout, double the risk of suicidal ideation, poor quality of life, and increased medical care errors. And you can see that really across the board, ranging from non-clinical to research faculty and staff to nurses and APPs, we're looking at between 40 and 60% in terms of current distress. So this is very concerning to me. So we're not out of the woods yet. We did a similar analysis looking at what are the top 10 things explaining these overall distress scores. And we looked in 2020, 2021, and 2022. Unfortunately, what we saw is that it's mostly the work. And I will say here that we controlled for over 40 different factors looking at age, race, gender, caregiving responsibilities, individual resilience, you name it. And this is what is predicting that variance in distress. And so it's mostly the work. And it wasn't really necessarily COVID, which was alarming to me. I thought these COVID factors would be much higher on the list. But it's all the same things that we would expect, from the drivers that we know are associated with burnout to, how we know that humans want to be treated. They want things to be fair, they want to be appreciated, and they want reasonable workloads. In 2021, same thing, all the work. Individual resilience didn't even make it on the top 10 list, meaning this is not a, wimpy healthcare workers need to suck it up problem. This is the work is really broken, and these are some of the most resilient people on the planet problem. And in 2022, here we are. What's interesting to me is we asked about not only work-related factors, but also personal factors, ranging from divorce, death of a loved one, you name it. And what made the very top of this list was job satisfaction in terms of factors that improve or decrease well-being. That might seem obvious, but what this data is essentially saying is you cannot be well if you're not satisfied at work. That is really highlights the onus of responsibility of organizations to provide healthy work for their people, because it has a significant relationship to their well-being. On the right-hand side, you can also see our rates of reported symptoms of PTSD and compassion fatigue, and that's the number 2 predictor on the list for decreased well-being. So this includes both non-clinical people and clinical people. This is not just a clinician problem, and we know that there were many events, whether that was racial reckoning and all of the things that were happening around race at that time. It was COVID, it was loss of family and loved ones, it was loss of coworkers, and the loss of our way of life. And so between 10 and 20, upwards of 20% of people are reporting these symptoms, which is very concerning. Okay, so with that, we're going to talk a little bit about trauma, trying to keep it nice and light for everybody. And so I worked really hard on this slide, as you can see. It's important that we distinguish between burnout and trauma, because the symptoms of these two things manifest very similarly. But the way we address it can actually worsen our opportunity to improve if we treat one like the other. So let me explain that more. If we treat trauma like burnout, we can actually make it worse, okay? If I am a traumatized individual and I'm having flashbacks, I'm having intrusive thoughts, recurring remembrances of the event, physical triggers that are reminding me of that trauma, if you tell me to go take a vacation, to leave my workplace, to go be in solitude and take a vacation and rest, it's not going to help me improve. It's going to mean that all of those distractions that I had that helped me kind of push that trauma to the back of my mind are now going to be right here, right? And so when we tell traumatized people to go rest so that you'll feel better, go take a vacation, it can actually make it worse. It's not helpful. When we tell burned out people to do that, that's a good solution. And so it's really important that we're appropriately understanding what are the sources of that distress in individuals and that we're not applying the wrong treatment. lost my slide here. Hang on. Oop, there we go. We recently reporting PTSS, post-traumatic stress symptoms. We also saw that there were some things that are protective against reporting those symptoms, and that includes sense of recognition. And that is on both lists, as well as trust and confidence in senior leadership. And then you see some work-related factors that tend to potentially exacerbate or are associated with increased reporting of those symptoms. And that includes feeling mistreated by other employees at work, qualities, concern over the quality of care that's been provided, and discrimination at work. On the personal side, we see that strained relationship with loved ones, so reduced social support, and whether or not you or your family or a close friend had COVID-19 also appeared on this list. And so lastly, I should mention that exhaustion or burnout from the stresses of caregiving or parenting during the pandemic also appeared in both groups. And so we see that current rates of stress involving caregiving and elder care responsibilities is actually fairly low, 1 to 2%, but the rates of continued stress, residual stress from the difficulty of that time is much higher. We're seeing those rates at 17 to 25%. So people are still hanging on to some of that stress of that time. Okay, so what is trauma? We're talking about trauma. What is it? We used to conceptualize post-traumatic stress disorder as primary and secondary, meaning the thing happened to you and you have trauma symptoms, or you witnessed something happening to others, secondary PTSD, and so you're having symptoms. That's actually no longer the way that we approach it, because the body's physiological response and our cognitive processes actually respond the same, whether or not it happened to you or whether or not you've observed a trauma. And so there's really not as much of a distinction as we originally thought. And so defining trauma, it's, the person is exposed to or witnessed death, threatened death, actual or threatened injury, or actual or threatened sexual trauma, whether it happened to them or they watched it happen to a patient, a family member, et cetera. And so when I read this definition, I thought, oh my gosh, every healthcare worker, right, meets this definition, particularly during COVID. So there are some risk factors that predispose people to having a more of a challenging time processing trauma. Past trauma is a huge one. So people who have not resolved, maybe through professional help, past traumas in their life, new trauma just gets added on top and becomes very difficult to deal with. Substance abuse history and poor social support, which we also saw in the previous data. Trauma is pretty scary on the brain. There's this notion of temporal confusion, meaning when something triggers a person's trauma response, their body reacts as though the trauma is happening right now. The brain is not distinguishing that this is something that happened in the past. The brain is saying, oh my gosh, it's happening again right now. And so people's physiological responses are really not that different when trauma is triggered than they were when the trauma was happening. And so this is a really big problem. People are amped up, hyper aroused. They may have difficulty sleeping. There's a physical response, which may include increased heart rate, diarrhea, et cetera. And, it really helps people once they can make sense of trauma and categorize it in the right part of their brain. But and that usually requires some type of professional help. But until that happens, people can continue having these symptoms. Okay, we got to be looking out for each other, right? And our colleagues and our students, because as we saw in the previous slides, this is a problem for 10 to 30% of the people that we interact with and touch every day. These are some signs of distress that you can be looking for. I read this and I was like, oh my gosh, maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm distressed. But uncharacteristically short-fused, withdrawn or isolated, physical signs like an untidy appearance or exhaustion, changes in how people do work, a lot of absenteeism, tardiness, poor performance, et cetera, and unusual behavior, frequent tearfulness or outbursts. And so these are things to be looking for. And if you see these signs, you got to check in on your people. So that's really critical. So we'll pivot briefly to discussing some principles of trauma-informed leadership. These are things both that we need to be doing in our own teams, but also teaching to our students. So essentially, the building blocks of trauma-informed leadership are these things. People want to feel heard, protected, prepared for what may come, supported, and cared for. And so this is what people who are struggling with trauma expect and need from their leaders. In terms of actual tools and skills, and I'll send out these slides afterwards so that we don't have to read everything right now. These are sort of 4 things that you can do, 4 skills that you can practice, and language that you can use in having these conversations. So let's say you're noticing that a colleague or a student is exhibiting some of the signs of distress, but you're like, oh gosh, I don't know what to say. This is your slide about what to say. So there's the practice of attuning, which is, creating a human connection. And so that's, leaning in, being focused, making sure that that person understands that they have your full attention for this very important conversation. And you can say things like, thank you for coming to me. I'm really honored that you would share this sensitive story with me. And it totally makes sense that you would feel overwhelmed by all these things that have happened to you. Wondering, which is, the practice of curiosity and genuine interest to try to open a conversation. So, how are you? I really want to know how you're doing, or what matters to you? What's important to you? Some of these things can help you open that conversation. Following is the practice of quiet listening. So you're not trying to one up. You're not trying to say, oh, thanks for sharing your story. Listen to what happened to me. It was even worse. You're trying to allow the person to express emotions, and you're sort of actively listening by reframing or rephrasing what they're saying to make sure that you're understanding. So, do I have this right? Or it sounds like maybe this is what you're saying. Is that correct? And asking what's most important to the person in that moment. And then a sense of holding, which is creating a safe place, making sure that person knows that you've got them, right? And so there are some ways for you to do that also with the language. So I won't read all these to you, but I really liked these practical tips from this article because I don't always know what to say and do exactly in the moment. There are also ways that leaders can help guide and facilitate post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth means that instead of, when you go through a potentially traumatizing situation, instead of it damaging you, it makes you stronger, right? These are some questions that you can use to sort of help your teams or your people refocus on maybe some opportunities that have come out of that challenge and suffering. A really important note here, we don't want to sort of exhibit toxic positivity where we're saying, just look for the silver lining, everything happens for a reason. That makes me want to punch you if I'm suffering, right? But we can help people redirect on their own strength in going through these types of things. So these are some questions that I really liked. What seemed difficult before the trauma that now seems easier for you, given everything that you've gone through? And it might be, I don't know about you guys, but there were things that used to stress me out in 2019 that now I'm like, no big deal, right? After all the craziness that we went through with COVID. What advice would you have for other people who are in a similar situation? This helps people sort of verbalize their own learning that they may have taken from their trauma. What if you notice that you're grateful about yourself? I think you're such a wonderful person for these reasons. What do you like about yourself? And then what positive changes have you noticed maybe since this trauma happened that we can continue building on? So those are some things that we can do with our teams. We saw in the previous slides that recognition was also often on the top 10 list of not only things that help people want to stay and recommend the organization, things that are associated with lower distress, but also that potentially are protective against developing symptoms of post-traumatic stress. And so we asked people, how do you like to be recognized? Because I don't always know. And we got a lot of feedback. To be fair, a lot of people said money. We don't really have money, so that's off the table, but we saw a lot of things that are free. And so doubling down on recognition represents a critical opportunity for us when we're thinking about our workforce. Usually recognition is free. We had 130 people say, just say thank you, say good morning. People want to feel seen and heard, and they want to know that leadership sees them. And so I also wanted to show this slide, particularly for our academic partners who are thinking about how they're training their students to go into the workforce. People want leaders to be rounding and visible. And it can be really uncomfortable, right? Your first time rounding is probably super uncomfortable. Like, where do I go? Who do I talk to? What questions do I ask? And so if we're not giving students an opportunity to practice rounding with a lot of feedback and in a safe environment, they're going to be uncomfortable when they go in as executives for this. And so this is something that we really need to emphasize, the importance of creating a culture of rounding and visibility. And it's critical for building trust. You cannot trust someone that you don't know and haven't seen. So we know that trust is sliding. We know that it's critically important for other measures that we care about. And we know that having some face time and visibility is one way to help build it. Culture, I'm not going to say a lot here. It's super important. We know this, but it's something that we have to double down on. We talked about already that the healthcare workforce is diminishing. We have a lot of challenges ahead, and the organizations with the best culture will win. If I'm thinking about my life being short and wanting to spend my time in a meaningful, purposeful way, I can get that at any healthcare organization. But I also don't want to have to put up with all the junk that comes with a toxic culture. And it's expensive too. A huge study looking at 1.4 million Glassdoor reviews found that toxic corporate culture was 10.4 times more likely to result in turnover from the organization than compensation. So essentially what this data is telling us is you cannot afford a bad culture, right? It's too expensive. At the end of the day, when we're thinking about our human margin, people want to be treated as humans. And you can see these quotes that are really referring to themselves in dehumanizing terms. I want to be valued as a human. You're squeezing more juice out of an already macerated fruit, which is like a super elegant way to say beaten to a pulp. So it's really critical that we drill this into not only our current leaders, but also our students, this importance of prioritizing the human margin over so many other things. When that is taken care of, everything else falls into place. So I'll stop there, and we'll open it up for Q&A and some discussion. And Ren, I know we had talked about the possibility of doing breakout rooms, but it's also, somewhat of a smaller group. So I'll defer to you on whether or not we should do breakout rooms or just talk in a group.
Catherine, I think we have 20 minutes, and with the smaller group, it might be okay for us to stay together.
Great. Okay, well, we will stay together. So what questions or comments do you have? I mean, are you seeing this manifest in your students? Are you seeing this in organizations? Are you like, what is this lady talking about? This does not apply to me at all. Hey, Kathy.
I'll toss something out for discussion. Was there somebody else who started talking?
No, I saw you unmute. Let's hear it.
Okay. Before I came back to Cornell 3 years ago, I had done my whole career in the Hartford, Connecticut area, and I managed practices for 15 of those years, the last 15 before I came back to academia. And as I saw everything progress in medical practices, and then go into COVID and so forth, it's been my belief, and I actually have a couple of students helping kind of put together these thoughts and so forth. It's my belief that doctors were very distressed leading up to even more distress. And I think that's evidenced by the fact that after 3 or 4 decades of just great growth in physician practices, going from solo practitioners to single specialty groups to multi-specialty groups, all this build, physician ownership and so forth, they started selling out. And I think doctors were distressed when they started selling out. And, then when it ramped up into COVID and everything that happened to them at that time, then the doctors started to leave. I just wondered if you had any thoughts or observations around that hypothesis.
Yes. So yeah, it was broken before and now it's more broken. I mean, that's the basic gist. We've been talking about physician burnout for some time. Rates were hovering around 40% nationally pre-pandemic, and now we're seeing rates closer to 50 to 60% depending on the source. And so certainly it was bad before and it has gotten worse. I think, there are a couple pressures that have been pushing on physicians specifically. physician compensation has decreased over the past 25 years. Autonomy has also decreased as people have transitioned from private practice into employed physician roles. And autonomy is generally a higher need that we see in our data for our physician groupings versus other specialties. And then there's also, sort of this tension that's existing between certain groups of physicians and advanced practice providers, where people say, wait a minute, I did 12 years of school and took on 300,000 in debt, and now you're telling me a nurse can do my job. And so I think there's some of that scope of practice tension that also is eroding some of that sense of pride in the profession. And so you're quite right to note that it was a problem before and continues to be. And so, I think we have some pretty serious changes to consider. We also, unfortunately, 2 in 5 physicians is predicted to retire in the next 10 years. So the aging of our workforce is a major factor in this as well. Ryan, I see your hand.
Hey, Catherine. Thanks. Great material. Such an important topic. I appreciate the work that you're doing on this. A question for you. You mentioned about the cultural attributes, and there's so many things that we can be doing for free that are going to make a meaningful difference. And I totally agree with you on that. My question is, have you seen, or can you point us to, or is there other data or studies out there that show the impact of that, maybe in comparison to other organizations in any given market? Those that have measurable improvements in culture are outperforming their competitors and other types of metrics and things like that, because I think that evidence brings even more power to that message, particularly when we're sharing it with students. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, at this exact moment, a lot of that recent information is anecdotal. And but I'm going to look after this and see if I can find anything that's published in the post-pandemic period that I can send out to this group.
Yeah, and please take my comments as very supportive, of course, because I totally believe it as well. And I just want to bring even more power to it, particularly for our students, because they need to be the the advocates and the supporters of that approach, for sure.
Absolutely. And I think to me, sort of the closest I can get, at least that's really recent, is looking at these things that are predicting turnover, right? If there are cultural elements there, that's telling me that I'm going to have a harder time recruiting. And we know that talent is certainly linked, having the right talent and having enough people is certainly linked to other measures of performance, including patient safety, financial performance, et cetera. So that's maybe a circuitous way to get there, but absolutely.
Thanks.
It sounds like we need to write a paper about this. So there we go.
Count me in.
Julie, good to see you.
Good to see you. It's what you were talking about. Your research is so compelling, and I really appreciate that you've sort of gotten 3 years worth. And what I'm thinking about in my head is sort of your process of doing the research. You have a wellness role, I think, in the same health system where you studied, where you gathered the data. And so I'm just kind of curious, like, or has there been any kind of real-time response, and what has been the hardest thing to kind of enact in terms of changes? Because obviously there's a commitment if they have you embedded in gathering the data. Or I shouldn't say obviously, I guess I'm assuming.
Yeah, let me think about how to answer this one. So it's been political and challenging.
Okay.
I think, in every organization, there are probably people who are more eager to hear bad news and change, and other people who are not as eager to hear bad news and change. And so that's certainly true in my organization as well. I think where we've gotten a lot of traction is in being able to show leaders their own data and to say, these are the things statistically that are going to give you the best chance at moving this. In the absence of that data, there's a lot of guesswork that happens. And so, we have gotten a lot farther in our wellness conversation because we're able to say, in this organization, here's what we're seeing. Everybody thinks they're special, right? So nothing that we've found is really different than what I would expect from decades of organizational behavior literature. It's like, oh, autonomy matters. Oh, big surprise. But I think for people to say, no, this is my own data about us, has convinced some of these decision makers to maybe get a little bit more urgent about taking some action, because you sort of lose the opportunity to say, well, that doesn't apply to me. The other thing I'll say is that we have, I tell this to my students, I would love everybody to really invest in wellness because it's the right thing to do and because caring for your people is the right thing to do. But we have to speak the language of administration and leadership to convince. And so when I can come to them and say, I have 764,000 data points and this is what it's telling us, and a good juicy quote from an employee that isn't me, it's getting that attention in a way that we really weren't seeing before when we were kind of taking the wellness is the right thing to do angle. I don't know if that answers your question, Julie. What else? Who else? Other comments or things that you're seeing working with your students, maybe that you guys are doing to address well-being? Hi, Justine. Saw you unmute.
Yeah, I'm wondering just if there are conversations in organizations around how do we live in recovery from COVID, because this idea of let's all try to achieve wellness in light of all of the things you pointed out, that there's a growth trajectory happening here. It's not dichotomous. I'm just wondering what the answer is to sort of the coping or switching the narrative to more we're in recovery and we're working together and we're surviving. So just wanted to kind of make that quasi comment / question to see what work is being done in that area.
Yeah, that's a really good comment. I'm seeing a range of responses here. Some of you may be familiar, and I had it in the slides, but I took it out, should have kept it in, with the HRSA disaster recovery curve, which basically shows that, there's sort of this initial period of coming together, healthcare heroes, banging on pots and pans, and then a long season of disillusionment that lasts up to about a year. The 1-year anniversary is kind of a trigger point, and then you start to see some steady recovery. In healthcare, that model was designed for like hurricanes and tornadoes that are discrete events that happen over the course of 1 to 3 days. It was not designed for a 3-year, let's say 2-year, slow moving mass casualty event. And so I do think we have to really recalibrate our expectations for how fast that recovery is going. To support your point. The other thing I'll say is that, I think there's, in some organizations or some leaders, there's an eagerness to okay, let's get back to this initiative or get back to this thing. And I think people are not ready for that yet. They're not ready for a bunch of new programs and initiatives and getting back into really motivated action around trying new things and change. I think people are still just kind of wanting to catch their breath. And I think that's going to last longer than most leaders want or expect, but we have to be okay with it.
Thank you. Yeah, because it prompted me around the trauma discussion of this is a longer lasting effect than an early burnout situation. So how are we thinking of that differently? Because individuals now will be more susceptible to the burnout trajectory in light of the trauma.
That's right. So a lot of organizations are doing a lot around peer support and specific trauma-focused interventions. We probably don't have enough mental health providers to meet the enormous need. And so your peers who know the situation, who went through it together with you, really are kind of our next best option. And so I'm really encouraged to see a lot of organizations with very robust peer support programs. Any other thoughts or comments?
Catherine has,
go ahead. No, yeah. Nope.
Has UAB started looking at offering different interventions like for burnout versus trauma, and how are you identifying which staff have burnout versus trauma so that you can ensure that they're getting the like evidence-based support that they need for the condition that they're currently living with?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're doing a couple things. One, we have EAP services and counseling. So each employee is eligible for 12 counseling sessions. And so those are licensed professional counselors that are trained to identify what's what, right? But we're really trying to work directly also with our leaders on a lot of training to sensitize them about the differences between burnout and trauma, how to look for the signs, how to provide quality peer support. Because those are the people that, if someone's not seeking help, like the people who are seeking help are already on their way to recovery, right? That's a good sign that they've taken that step. It's the people who aren't seeking help that we need our leaders and managers who are seeing and working alongside them every day to be able to encourage and facilitate some of that growth, even moving towards seeking help. That said, we're also I shouldn't say we're experimenting on people. That sounds bad. It's not exactly that, but we're testing and evaluating a new form of therapy called rapid resolution therapy. It's an alternative to EMDR that, rather than 6 to 12 hour-long sessions, is typically 1 to 2 sessions, and has been really successful so far in helping people recategorize their trauma and reducing some of those physical responses to the trauma. And so we're working on a big intervention related to testing that and trying to put the right science around it in terms of effectiveness. We're also doing some things around peer support and in a few different modalities. I think there are other organizations represented here that are probably further along in their peer support journey, but we have a range of options, including 24/7 support, a line, hotline that you can call, versus unit-based interventions that are really trying to equip people to have those tools. Any other questions? I have 2 kids, so silence is kind of a treat. I'll just let it be. Well, I appreciate, yeah, go for it, Jen.
I just had a quick question. Thinking about the attuning and following that you were talking about, I'm wondering if there's any research or any in-depth on generational differences when it comes to that. When we're thinking about the newer generation of students that are coming into the workforce is very different from, the last 15 and 20 years. So how we're approaching them is different, and how we're working with them is going to look different. So just curious if there's any thoughts around that.
Yeah, I think that certainly plays into this conversation in a major way. So many differences in the context that our younger students or employees are existing in, versus some of the conditions that were present when the older generation was that age. Interestingly, what we see in much of our research is that when we control for age and some of these factors, it's typically non-significant, which I did not expect. Other than that, we do see that our younger employees are more likely to experience violence and mistreatment from patients, physical violence and verbal violence. And my guess, although I can't say this with our data, is that they maybe represent an easier target for patient and family violence, unfortunately. That said, I think with any type of intervention related to trauma and an interpersonal interaction, giving the person what they need is really important. And so I'm a fan of just asking, like, what does support from me look like? Do you just want me to listen? Do you want me to problem solve? And allowing that person to sort of guide me on their preferences. I'll also say with my own students, because I teach undergraduate, master's, and doctoral students. I'm very proactive about reaching out when I notice that someone's late on an assignment or they've missed, an assignment or two I usually just start with, I just want to make sure you're okay. Are you okay? Is anything going on? How can I support you? And sometimes it's, they're like, oh, thanks for checking. And sometimes people pour out their whole life story and they need a lot of support. And so I never want to be in the position where I didn't ask, and then I had to wonder later if I could have helped. So I think if you are approaching it with humility, a genuine desire to help and be of service, and you're willing to ask people what they need, then some of those generational, gender, race, etc., role differences, become less important maybe. Well, you guys are awesome. I see so many great faces here, great leaders, and please keep in touch. I know many of us are already in touch, and it's great to be with you today. And I really appreciate the opportunity. I'll send out the slides afterwards, and feel free to always. I'll put my email in the chat, and if you ever, want to follow up or have a question, then I'm happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Catherine. We appreciate you.
My pleasure. Take care, everybody.
Take care.
Well, I can go ahead and get us kicked off